A brief introduction to Viktor E. Frankl. Viktor Emil Frankl, 1905 a 1997, was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and later the founder of Logotherapy, a branch of existential psychology. Before World War II, he was already a respected doctor in Vienna, working with patients struggling with depression and even preventing suicides. But his life changed forever when he, along with his family, was deported to Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Frankl lost his parents, brother, and pregnant wife in the Holocaust. Yet, out of this unimaginable suffering, he developed a philosophy that has inspired millions. Even in the darkest conditions, life has meaning, and we can choose our attitude toward suffering. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, is both a memoir of survival and a psychological guide to finding purpose. Arrival in the camp. When Frankl first stepped off the train at Auschwitz, he wasn't just entering a prison, he was entering a world designed to erase humanity. The air was filled with barking dogs, shouting guards, and the heavy silence of fear. Prisoners stumbled out of the wagons after days without food or water, their eyes wide with shock. This book has been divided into 8 chapters, and each chapter has been explained separately in detail. These was the first stage, Frankl describes. Psychological shock. The mind simply couldn't process the brutality. Some clung to denial. It can't be that bad. Others collapsed into despair before the real suffering even began. Stripped of identity, the first thing taken was identity. Clothes, belongings, even hair gone. Each man became nothing more than a number tattooed on his arm. Frankl himself, once a respected doctor, was reduced to a prisoner. Yet, even in that moment, he realized something profound. They can take everything from me except my ability to choose my attitude. That seed of thought would later grow into his philosophy of logotherapy. The selection line. One of the most terrifying moments was the selection line. Prisoners were divided left or right, life or death, based on a guard's quick glance. Stronger men were sent to labor, weaker ones to the gas chambers. In seconds, fate was sealed. Frankl recalls standing in line, heart-pounding, not knowing if he'd live another hour. He noticed how some men prayed, Otters Korzed, and some stood numb. That moment revealed a truth: survival wasn't guaranteed by strength alone. It depended on chance, but also on inner resilience. First night in the camp. The first night was unforgettable. Packed into barracks, prisoners lay on wooden planks, crammed together like hunger gnawed at their stomachs, lice crawled on their skin, and the stench of death lingered. Yet, even here, Frankl observed something remarkable. Some men still whispered words of comfort, shared a crust of bread, or offered a prayer. This was his first glimpse of a theme that would echo throughout the book. Even in hell, humanity can shine. The psychology of shock. Frankl explains that the initial shock had a brief introduction to Viktor E. Frankl. Viktor Emil Frankl, 1905 to 1997, was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and later the founder of Logotherapy, a branch of existential psychology. Before World War II, he was already a respected doctor in Vienna, working with patients struggling with depression and even preventing suicides. But his life changed forever when he, along with his family, was deported to Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Frankl lost his parents, brother, and pregnant wife in the Holocaust. Yet, out of this unimaginable suffering, he developed a philosophy that has inspired millions. Even in the darkest conditions, life has meaning, and we can choose our attitude toward suffering. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, is both a memoir of survival and a psychological guide to finding purpose. The psychology of shock. Frankl explains Theodolea Zuno. Disbelief. The mind refuses to accept reality, prisoners thought. This must be temporary. Surely the world will intervene. Those numbness. Once reality sank in, emotions shut down, tears dried up. Fear turned into a kind of cold detachment. This numbness was a survival mechanism. If prisoners felt the full weight of horror all at once, they would break. Lessons from Chapter 1. Shock is natural when life collapses. Identity can be stripped, but inner freedom remains. Survival begins with purpose. Humanity survives in kindness. Closing reflection. Chapter on isn't just about Auschwitz, it's about the universal human experience of being thrown into chaos. Whether it's war, loss, or personal crisis, we all face moments where life feels stripped bare. Frankl's message is clear. Even in the darkest arrival, when everything familiar is gone, we still hold the power to choose our response. That choice is the seed of meaning. From person to number after the initial shock of arrival, the next stage of camp life was the erasure of individuality. Viktor Frankl, once a respected doctor in Vienna, was reduced to a tattooed number on his arm. No name, no title, no past, just digits. This was not accidental. The system was designed to crush the human spirit by stripping away every marker of identity. Personas lost their clothes, their hair, their possessions. A man who once wore a suit and carried himself with dignity now stood in rags, indistinguishable from thousands of others. Frankl recalls how quickly people realized that their old lives' family photos, manuscripts, careers were gone. The Nazis wanted them to feel like faceless objects, not human beings. Psychology of Frankl explains that this process of dehumanization had a deep psychological effect. When you are treated like an object long enough, you begin to feel like one. Prisoners stopped referring to themselves as individuals and began to think of themselves as part of a mass. Names erased. A man was no longer Carl or Joseph, but prisoner 119,104. Status erased. Professors, bakers, farmers, all equalized into the same striped uniform. Future erased with no certainty of tomorrow. Time itself lost meaning. TS was the second stage of camp psychology. Apathy and detachment. The loss of dignity. Frankl describes moments when prisoners were forced to endure humiliation, standing naked in the cold, being beaten for no reason, or watching others collapse from exhaustion. The goal was not just physical suffering, but the destruction of dignity. Yet Frankl insists dignity could still be preserved internally. Even when stripped of everything, a man could still choose to carry himself with inner pride. He recalls prisoners who, despite hunger and weakness, walked upright, spoke kindly, or shared their last piece of bread. These small acts were proof that identity could not be fully erased. The uniformity of suffering in the camp. Everyone looked the same. Shaved heads, hollow eyes, striped uniforms. The individuality of faces blurred into a sea of suffering. Frankl notes how quickly prisoners adapted to this new reality. The shock of losing identity gave way to numbness. T's numbness was both a curse and a survival tool. On one hand, it meant prisoners stopped feeling the full weight of humiliation. On the other, it risked erasing the very sense of self that gave life meaning. The inner resistance, the speed of the system's attempt to erase identity. Frankl argues that the inner self remained untouchable. A man could still decide who he was on the inside. He could still remember his loved ones, his values, his faith. Frankl himself clung to the memory of his wife. Didn't know if she was alive. The thought of her gave him strength. In his mind, he could still speak to her, still love her. That inner connection preserved his identity even when the outside world tried to erase memory. Became a lifeline. Prisoners would recall past moments, family dinners, music, books, conversations. These memories reminded them that they were more than prisoners. They were fathers, sons, husbands, thinkers, dreamers. Frankl emphasizes that memory was not just nostalgia, it was resistance. By remembering who they were, prisoners refused to let the camp define them completely. The choice of attitude lies. Frankl's central insight. Even when stripped of everything, man still has the freedom to choose his attitude. Some prisoners gave in to despair, becoming shells of themselves. Others chose defiance not by fighting guards, but by holding on to dignity, kindness, and meaning. Frankl writes, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." T's line is the heartbeat of the book. Lessons from Chapter 2. Dehumanization is powerful, but not absolute. Systems can strip away names and possessions, but not the inner self. Those memory preserves identity. Recalling love, art, or faith keeps the spirit alive. Tres attitude is freedom. Even in chains, one can choose dignity over despair. Quattro identity is more than externals. True selfhood lives in values, not uniforms or titles. Closing reflection. Chapter 2 shows that the greatest battle in the camp was not for food or survival, it was for identity. The Nazis tried to erase individuality, but Frankl discovered that the human spirit could resist. Even when reduced to a number, a man could still say, "I am me. I choose who I am inside." This lesson extends beyond the camp. In modern life, people often feel reduced to numbers, IDs, salaries, statistics. Frankl's message is timeless. Your true identity is not what the world gives you, but what you choose to hold within. The routine of survival, once the initial shock of arrival and the stripping of identity had passed, prisoners entered what Frankl calls the second psychological phase. Apathy. This wasn't laziness or indifference, it was a defense mechanism. To survive, the mind had to numb itself against constant hope. In the camp was brutally repetitive. Wake up before dawn. Stand in freezing roll calls for hours. March to forced labor sites. Work until exhaustion. Return to barracks. Receive a thin soup or a crust of bread. Collapse into sleep, only to repeat it all again. To monotony was prisoners collapsing. Hunger as a constant companion. Hunger was the central fact of camp life. Prisoners thought about food constantly. Conversations revolved around recipes, memories of meals, or dreams of banquets. Frankl recalls how men would describe in detail the dishes they once enjoyed, as if talking about food could temporarily satisfy them. T's obsession with food wasn't weakness, it was survival. The body demanded energy, and the mind tried to cope by it as a shield. At first, prisoners were horrified by the sight of death, but after weeks, they could walk past corpses without flinching. Tears dried up, shock turned into indifference. It was the only way to endure. If prisoners allowed themselves to feel the full weight of suffering every day, they would collapse. Apathy dulled the pain, like a sight constant humiliation. Guards shouted insults, forced prisoners into meaningless tasks, or beat them for no reason. Frankl describes how even small acts of cruelty, like being denied a meal, designed to break the spirit. Yet he also noticed that not every guard was cruel. Some showed moments of unexpected kindness, offering the inner world as refuge, while the outer world was filled with suffering. Frankl discovered that the inner world could be a place of freedom. Prisoners who could retreat into memory, imagination, or Frankl himself often thought of his wife. He didn't know if she was alive, but in his mind he could see her face, hear her voice, and feel her love. These inner experiences gave him meaning and helped him endure. Through love and in love, acts of kindness became powerful. Sharing a piece of bread, offering a comforting word, or helping a weaker prisoner stand during roll call were acts of. Frankl emphasizes that these gestures, though tiny, proved that the human spirit could not be completely crushed. Who played a role. Prisoners would sometimes make jokes about their situation, mocking the absurdity of camp life. Frankl recalls how he and a friend would invent imaginary lectures about camps. By laughing, prisoners reminded themselves that they were still human. Prisoners who lost hope often died quickly. When a man believed he had nothing left to live for, his body seemed to give up. He would stop moving and soon collapse. Even fragile hope was essential. A dream of Lessons from Chapter 3. Apathy is survival. Emotional numbness protects the mind from constant trauma. Those hunger dominates. The body's needs shape. The mind's focus, inner life, is freedom. Memory, love, and imagination provide strength. Quattro kindness is resistance. Small acts preserve humanity. Cinco hope sustains life. Without purpose, survival becomes impossible. Closing reflection. Chapter 3 reveals the paradox of camp life. To survive, prisoners had to become numb. Yet to truly live, they had to hold on to meaning. Apathy dulled the pain, but love, memory, humor, and kindness kept the spirit alive. Tresan Frankl's insight is timeless. In any situation of suffering, we can retreat into our inner world, find strength in love, and resist despair with small acts of humanity. Even when life reduces us to routine and hardship, meaning can still be found. Glimpses of light and darkness by the time prisoners settled into the grim rhythm of camp life. It seemed as though cruelty and despair ruled every corner. Yet Viktor Frankl insists that even in the darkest environment, humanity never fully disappeared. Amid the brutality, there were moments, small, fragile, but real, where kindness, compassion, and dignity broke through. Frankl's observations here are crucial. They show that even when stripped of freedom, food, and safety, people could still choose to act with decency. These choices, however small, became acts of resistance against a system designed to crush the human spirit. Duality of guards. Frankl notes that not all guards were the same. Many were cruel, mocking, or indifferent to suffering. But occasionally, a guard would show unexpected kindness, slipping a prisoner an extra potato, offering a word of encouragement, or turning a blind eye to a minor infraction. These histories didn't erase the horror of the camps, but they reminded prisoners that good and evil exist in every human being. Frankl emphasizes that cruelty was not inevitable. It was a choice. And if guards could choose kindness in such a system, prisoners could too. Prisoners helping prisoners. Even more powerful were the acts of solidarity among prisoners themselves. Despite starvation, some men shared their last piece of bread. Others gave up a moment of rest to help a weaker comrade stand during roll call. Frankl recalls how these small sacrifices carried immense meaning. They proved that even in a place designed to reduce men to animals, the human spirit could rise above instinct. To give when you have nothing, that was true heroism. The choice to remain human. Frankl insists that the camp revealed a fundamental truth. A man always has a choice. He cannot always choose his circumstances, but he can choose his response. Some prisoners became brutal, hoarding food, betraying others, or aligning with guards to survive. Others chose dignity, kindness, and compassion, even at great personal cost. T's choice defined the essence of humanity. Frankl writes, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord S prayer, or the Shema Yisraelah, on his lips, the power of Lao. For Frankl, love was one of the strongest forces of humanity in the camp. He often thought of his wife, not knowing if she was alive. In moments of despair, he would imagine her face, her voice, her presence. That inner dialogue gave him strength. He realized that love transcends physical presence. Even in separation, even in death, love remains a source of meaning. This insight became one of the cornerstones of his philosophy. Love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Beauty as resistance. Another surprising source of humanity was beauty. Frankl recalls moments when prisoners paused to admire a sunset, a bird flying overhead, or the glow of the evening sky. These glimpses of nature reminded them that life still held wonder, even beyond the barbed wire. To stop and appreciate beauty in such a place was an act of defiance. It was sighing, "You cannot take away my ability to see meaning." Humor as humanity. Frankl also highlights humor as a survival tool. Prisoners would sometimes make jokes about their misery, mocking the absurdity of camp life. Frankl and a friend even created imaginary lectures about camp psychology, laughing at their own suffering. T's humor wasn't denial, it was a way of asserting humanity. By laughing, prisoners reminded themselves they were still more than victims. Lessons from Chapter 4. Good and evil coexist. Even in a system of cruelty, individuals could choose kindness. Small acts matter. Sharing bread or offering comfort preserve dignity. Love transcends suffering. Thinking of loved ones gave strength to endure. Beauty and humor are resistance. Appreciating life's small wonders kept the spirit alive. Choice defines humanity. Even in a roar, man can choose his attitude. Closing reflection. Chapter 4 is a reminder that humanity is never fully extinguished, even in the worst conditions. The camp stripped men of everything, but it could not strip them of choice. Some chose cruelty, but others chose compassion. Some gave in to despair, but others clung to love, beauty, and humor. Frankl's insight is timeless. The measure of a person is not found in comfort, but in how they respond to suffering. Even in horror we can choose to remain human. Lessons from Chapter 5:1, Purpose sustains life. A clear why gives strength to endure anyhow though hopelessness is deadly. When meaning is lost, decline is rapid. Tress suffering can hold meaning. Pain becomes bearable when seen as purposeful. 3 sources of meaning: work, love, an attitude toward suffering. 5, the will to meaning is the deepest human drive, stronger than pleasure or power. Closing reflection. Chapter 5 is the heart of man's search for meaning. Frankl shows that survival is not just about food or strength, it is about purpose. A man with a reason to live can endure unimaginable suffering. A man without meaning collapses, even in comfort. This lesson is universal, whether in a concentration camp or in everyday life. The question is the same. What is your why? Find it, and you can endure anything. The long-awaited freedom after years of unimaginable suffering. The day of liberation finally came. For many prisoners, this moment had been the dream that kept them alive, the vision of walking free, of eating without fear, of seeing loved ones again. Yet, when the gates of the camps were opened and the guards fled, the reality of freedom was far more complicated than anyone expected. Frankl describes this stage as the third psychological phase of camp life. The prisoners were free, but they were not the same men who had entered. Their bodies were frail, their spirits scarred, and their emotions strangely muted. The first steps outside. When the gates opened, many prisoners did not rush out in joy. Instead, they walked slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the freedom was an illusion. Some wandered into nearby fields, staring at flowers or touching the grass with disbelief. Frankl recalls how he and others felt strangely empty. They had dreamed of this moment for so long, but when it arrived, they could not feel the joy they expected. It was as if their emotions had been numbed by years of suffering, and now they could not switch them back on. The burden of emptiness. Liberation brought not only freedom, but also a heavy emptiness. Prisoners had survived for a purpose: reunion with family, rebuilding careers, or simply the dream of freedom. But now, many discovered that their loved ones were gone, their homes destroyed, their old lives erased. Frankl himself returned to Vienna, only to learn that his wife, parents, and brother had all perished. The manuscript he had hoped to rewrite was gone. The future he had imagined no longer existed. T's realization was devastating. Some survivors felt that life after the camp was harder than life inside it, because now they had to face the full weight of loss, the danger of bitterness. A no challenge was bitterness. Many survivors felt anger toward the world, the guards who had tormented them, toward neighbors who had betrayed them, or even toward God for allowing such suffering. Frankl warns that this bitterness was a trap. If survivors allowed hatred to dominate, they would remain prisoners even outside the camp. True freedom required letting go of vengeance and choosing to live with dignity. The struggle to feel joy. Frankl describes how difficult it was to feel joy again. Simple pleasures like eating a meal or walking in nature felt unreal. Some survivors laughed nervously. Others cried without knowing why. Many felt guilty for surviving when so many others had died. These survivors guilt haunted countless men and women. They asked themselves, why me? Why did I live when others, perhaps better than me, perished? Frankl's answer was that survival itself carried responsibility. Those who lived were called to bear witness, to rebuild, and to find meaning in the fact that they had been spared. Their return to society, re-entering society, was not easy. Survivors often found that people could not understand their experiences. Some were met with indifference, others with suspicion. The world wanted to move on, but the survivors carried memories that could never be erased. Frankl emphasizes that the task of survivors was not to forget, but to transform their suffering into testimony. By sharing their stories, they could give meaning to their pain and prevent history from repeating itself. The choice after liberation, just as in come freedom after liberation, came with a choice. Survivors could choose despair, bitterness, or numbness. They could choose to live with renewed purpose. Frankl chose the latter. He rebuilt his career, rewrote his lost manuscript, and dedicated his life to teaching logotherapy. For him, survival was not just luck, it was a responsibility to help others find meaning. Lessons from Chapter 6:1. Freedom is complex. Liberation does not erase trauma. It brings new challenges. Those emptiness follows survival. When old purposes are gone, new ones must be found. 3. Bitterness is a prison. True freedom requires forgiveness and dignity. 4. Survivors, guilt is real. The answer is to transform survival into responsibility. 5. Meaning continues after suffering. Life after trauma must still be lived with purpose. Close in reflection. Chapter 6 shows that liberation is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new struggle. Freedom without meaning can feel empty. Survivors had to rebuild their lives, mourn their losses, and resist the temptation of bitterness. Frankl's message is timeless. True freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of purpose. Even after suffering ends, the task of finding meaning continues. Chapter 7. Logotherapy. The will to meaning, explained expanded. From survivor to teacher after recounting the horrors of the camps, Viktor Frankl turns to the psychological insights that grew out of his experience. He introduces logotherapy, his unique approach to psychotherapy. The word comes from the Greek logos, meaning. Unlike other schools of psychology, logotherapy is built on the conviction that the primary human drive is not pleasure, Freud or Power Adler, but meaning. Frankl's survival in Auschwitz was living proof of this. He endured not because he was the strongest, but because he had a purpose, to love, to write, to teach. Now, he wanted to share this discovery with the world. The existential vacuum. Frankl begins by describing a modern problem he calls the existential vacuum, a sense of emptiness and aimlessness that afflicts many people. In the camps, this vacuum was deadly. Prisoners who felt life had no meaning gave up and died quickly. But Frankl saw the same problem outside the camps. People with comfort and freedom still felt hollow. This vacuum often leads to boredom, depression, addiction, or aggression. People try to fill the emptiness with pleasure, wealth, or power, but these substitutes never satisfy. Only meaning can. The will to meaning. At the heart of logotherapy is the will to meaning. Frankl argues that every human being is driven by the need to find purpose. When this need is frustrated, people suffer. When it is fulfilled, they thrive in suffering. It contrasts this with Freud's will to pleasure and Adler's will to power. In the concentration camp, pleasure was impossible, and power was stripped away. Yet men still survived if they had meaning. This, Frankl insists, proves that meaning is the deepest human drive. Logotherapy is not about analyzing the past endlessly. Instead, it is future-oriented. It asks, what is your purpose? What task, responsibility, or relationship gives your life meaning? Frankl describes 3 main ways people can discover meaning. 1. Through work or achievement, creating something, finishing a project, or contributing to society. Example, an artist finds meaning in painting, a teacher in shaping young minds. Those through love or relationships, experience in love, caring for others, or being responsible for someone. Example, a parent finds meaning in raising a child, a spouse in supporting their partner. 3. Through attitude towards suffering. When suffering is unavoidable, meaning can be found in how we face it. Example, a patient with terminal illness can inspire others by enduring with courage. Casey's studies in logotherapy. Frankl shares stories from his practice to illustrate how logotherapy works. The grieving husband. A man was devastated after his wife's death. Frankl asked him, "What would have happened if you had died first?" The man replied that his wife would have suffered terribly. Frankl pointed out that by surviving, the husband had spared her that pain. His suffering now had meaning. It was the price of his love. The despairing student. A young man felt his life was meaningless. Frankl asked him to imagine himself at the end of his life, looking back. What would give him pride? What would make his life worthwhile? This perspective helped the student see that he could create meaning through choices, not wait for it to appear. These examples show that logotherapy doesn't remove suffering, it reframes Italiano, freedom and responsibility. Frankl emphasizes that with freedom comes responsibility. Humans are free to choose their attitude, but they are also responsible for what they choose. Meaning is not handed to us. We must discover it. A even suggested that the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of America should be balanced by a Statue of Responsibility on the west coast, symbolizing that freedom without responsibility is incomplete. The uniqueness of each life. Another key idea is that meaning is individual and unique. There is no universal formula. What gives one person meaning may not work for another. Each life is like a question, and each person must answer it with their own actions. Frankl writes, life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. The role of suffering logotherapy does not glorify suffering, but it acknowledges that suffering can be meaningful. If pain is unavoidable, we can still choose our response. This transforms suffering from a curse into a challenge. Frankl insists, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning modern implications. Frankl warns that the existential vacuum is widespread in modern society. People chase pleasure, wealth, or distraction, but still feel empty. Logotherapy offers a solution. Instead of asking, what do I expect from life, we ask, what does life expect from me? T's shift from self-centeredness to responsibility creates meaning. Lessons from Chapter 7 Uno. The will to meaning is the deepest human drive, stronger than pleasure or power. Those meaning is found in work, love, and attitude toward suffering. Trey's suffering can be transformed. Pain becomes bearable when it has purpose. Quattro freedom requires responsibility. We must choose our response to life's questions. Cinco, meaning is unique. Each person must discover their own purpose. Closing reflection. Chapter 7 is the intellectual heart of man's search for meaning. Frankl moves from memoir to philosophy, showing how his survival insights became a therapeutic method. His message is clear. Life always has meaning, and it is our task to discover it. Even in suffering, even in emptiness, we can find purpose. And once with sway, we can endure anything. Chapter 8. Tragic optimism expanded a postscript of hope in the later editions of Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl added a powerful essay called The Case for a Tragic Optimism. It serves as both a conclusion and a challenge. After recounting the horrors of the Holocaust and explaining logotherapy, Frankl asks, how can we still say yes to life, in spite of everything? Tease is the essence of tragic optimism. The ability to remain hopeful and find meaning even in the face of suffering, guilt, and death. The tragic triad of human existence. The tragic triad. Frankl identifies three unavoidable aspects of life: uno, suffering, pain, loss, illness, and hardship are part of the human condition. Dos, guilt. Every person makes mistakes, fails, or falls short of their ideals. Tres, and death. Life is finite. Mortality is inescapable. TSA realities could lead to despair, but Frankl argues that they can also be transformed into opportunities for meaning. Suffering can lead to growth. Guilt can lead to change. Death can inspire us to live fully, saying yes to life. Frankl insists that optimism is not naive denial. It is not pretending that suffering doesn't exist. Instead, it is the courage to affirm life in spite of suffering. E writes, say yes to life, in spite of everything. This is not blind positivity, is a conscious choice to find meaning even in tragedy. The role of responsibility. Tragic optimism is rooted in responsibility. Life constantly asks us questions, and we must answer with our actions. Even in suffering, we are responsible for how we respond. Frankl emphasizes that meaning is not something we demand from life, it is something life demands from us. The question is not, what do I expect from life? But what does life expect from me? Transforming suffering. Frankl explains that suffering can be meaningful if it is unavoidable. If pain cannot be removed, it can still be endured with dignity. This transforms suffering into achievement. For example, a patient with terminal illness may inspire others by facing death with courage. A grieving parent may honor their child's memory by helping others. In this way, suffering becomes a source of meaning rather than despair. The danger of nihilism. Frankl warns against the modern danger of nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning. In a world of comfort and technology, many people still feel empty. This existential vacuum leads to depression, aggression, or addiction. Tragic optimism is the antidote. It acknowledges life's pain but insists that meaning is always possible. Optimism in the face of death, far from making life meaningless, gives it urgency. Knowing that time is limited pushes us to live authentically, to loathe deeply, and to act responsibly. Frankl compares life to a book with a final chapter. The ending does not erase the story, it gives it shape. Te courage. 2. Frankl's optimism is not shallow cheerfulness. It is courage. It is the decision to hope when despair seems easier. It is the refusal to let tragedy have the last word. A points to countless survivors who rebuilt their lives after the Holocaust, creating families, careers, and communities. Their resilience proves that even after unimaginable suffering, life can be affirmed. Lessons from Chapter 8. 1. Tragic optimism is realistic hope. It acknowledges suffering but chooses meaning. Those the tragic tried suffering, guilt, death can be transformed. Each holds potential for growth. 3. Responsibility is central. Life asks us to respond with dignity and purpose. 4. Nihilism is the real danger. Emptiness destroys faster than pain. 5. Saying yes to life is the ultimate act of defiance. Closing reflection. Chapter 8 is both a conclusion and a beginning. Frankl challenges us not just to survive, but to live with meaning. Tragic optimism is the art of affirming life, even when it hurts. It is the courage to say, yes, life is hard. Yes, I will suffer. Yes, I will die. But still, I choose to live with purpose. Die's final message makes man's search for meaning more than a Holocaust memoir or a psychology manual. It is a universal guide to resilience. Frankl's voice echoes across decades, reminding us that life always has meaning, no matter the circumstances.